Hello and welcome to the Nutritank podcast, where we interview leading experts within the field of food systems, nutrition, and lifestyle medicine. Our aim is to empower you, the next generation of healthcare professionals and change makers. We believe that the valuable knowledge and experience of our guests will inspire you to act and join the movement in creating a healthier population. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Nutritank podcast. Ian here, Nutritank co-founder. We hope you thoroughly enjoyed our last episode, where my podcast co-host Luke had an inspiring conversation with breathwork coach and wellbeing mentor Sophie True. Sophie developed her holistic self-care practice following a cancer diagnosis when she was only 23 years old, and now empowers others in self-care techniques. So if you haven't already listened to our last episode, it's definitely one to check out after today's. Welcome to today's episode of the Nutritank podcast. Guy Singh-Watson has over the last 35 years taken Riverford from one man and a wheelbarrow delivering homegrown organic veg to friends to a national veg box scheme delivering to 70,000 customers a week. Tired of meetings, brands, and the assumption that greed is our predominant motivation, Guy converted the business to employee ownership in 2018. Using the proceeds to buy a small farm and return to growing organic vegetables. In common with many of Riverford's co-owners, Guy is an advocate of using business to shape a part of the world, however small, to be kinder, more considerate and sustainable, more like the world most of us want to live in. A self-professed veg nerd, Guy's weekly newsletters connect people to the farm with refreshingly honest accounts of the trials and tribulations of producing organic food and the occasional rant about farming and ethical business issues he feels strongly about. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind our listeners that Nutritank is an apolitical and diet agnostic organization, and the views of our guests may not always align with the views of the company. Enjoy the episode. Guy, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast and welcome. And before we dive into the conversation, I just want to let the audience know with a bit of a backstory of how we got connected. Back in 2019, in October, we both attended as guests at the 2019 annual College of Medicine's Food on Prescription conference. And we both sat next to each other, and both of us gave our presentations. My presentation alongside co-founder Dr Ali Jaffe, and the conference was really inspiring. And it was all about how sort of systematic thinking, connecting planetary health and people health, and the speakers interwoven together, really sort of provided a great viewpoint for this. Yeah, before we dive in, what was your view of that conference, Guy? Do you ever think about it?
I guess it was my first real encounter with hearing people talk about the biome, hearing people talk about diet as even a cure, actually. I remember a paper a doctor giving where they're suggesting that, a diet could be a cure for at least 50% of type 2 diabetes, and subsequently went on to hear, what a role it had in inflammatory bowel disease. And so it was just great to hear doctors talking in a way that wasn't all about giving people pills, I suppose.
That's why Nutritank was founded in the first place, because of this new research coming through. And we thought it was really, really important that other doctors and medical students and healthcare professionals knew all about it. And College of Medicine is where we connected with lots of other like-minded organizations and doctors and came together to provide that information. Let's jump straight into our conversation. So, to begin with, where were you born? What's your backstory?
I was born on a farm, Riverford, about 3 miles from where I live now, in the parish of Staverton in Devon. My parents were tenant farmers, tenants of Church of England, pretty traditional kind of mixed farmers. Though actually traditional is the wrong word. There was nothing traditional about them. My father spent his entire life challenging norms, and I think I've carried on doing that. So he was always looking for a different and better way to farm.
So Riverford Organics, as it is now, what was it back then? When did you start it?
Well, I grew up on the farm and went away and studied agriculture and came back to join my father and my brother in the tenancy, and kind of argued quite a lot. And after a couple of years, I left, went off, did my time in London and New York as a management consultant, and then that didn't really work for me. Came back to the farm in end of 1986, having spent a lot of time looking for sort of growth markets for this hideous firm of management consultants. And I wanted to get back to the farm. I wanted to be outside. I knew I was unemployable. I couldn't bear working for other people. But I guess that exposure to the brutality of global markets, did make me not want to produce a commodity as my father had done. And organic vegetables seemed like a good way to go. I mean, it seemed like a growth market and something that had some sort of opportunity. It was in its very sort of nascent stages. The market was minuscule. But yeah, I went out there and ploughed up a field and sowed my first leeks, and without really knowing what I was doing, and learned pretty quickly through trial and error. Yeah, that was back in 1987, and just selling to local shops out of the back of delivering them in the back of my car. Actually, I mean, it was incredibly small scale. It was really just me and a wheelbarrow and a borrowed tractor, and yeah, my selling vegetables out of the back of my car. That was 37 years ago or something. Yeah.
What was it about commodity crops, or the mainstream way of growing vegetables that you didn't agree with?
At the time, I mean, I wasn't sort of massively committed to organic farming. I didn't like handling pesticides. I'd made myself sick as a teenager spraying my dad's barley, and my brother had actually just come out of hospital with glyphosate poisoning. Sorry, paraquat poisoning, another horrible herbicide. And yeah, so I just didn't like using the pesticides, and so that combined with seeing a market opportunity was the way that led me to do it. I'd say over, the subsequent 4 decades, every year that goes past, I've become more committed to, well, let's say just farming in a way that is sympathetic with my surroundings, with nature. And the closest I can get to that in a way that I can be supported in my activities by the marketplace is to be an organic farmer. I mean, I don't think organic farming is perfect. I don't think it's the only solution or a complete solution, but it is about the best thing that I can align myself under current circumstances.
Barriers, did you come up against? Did you come up against barriers within, the industry? Were there people saying this isn't the right way to do things? Organic farming, it wasn't what the status quo was doing?
Back in those days, it was a very fringe activity. I mean, I live in, near Totnes, which is a very alternative town, always has been, and, perhaps in some ways forward looking. And so, though it was a bit of a thing locally, it wasn't, you only had to go 10 miles and it wouldn't be at all. And most of my neighbors thought I was bonkers. And most of my school friends thought I was bonkers, and I worked crazy long hours. And I don't know, probably was bonkers. A lot of entrepreneurs are. It's almost a requirement, really. But the more I did it, the more I kind of loved it. I know, I consider myself to be very lucky to have found my thing. I mean, I always liked farming, and I guess I wanted to be a farmer on some level. But to have actually, I just really love growing vegetables. That is, and I love learning every day, every season, trying to be better at doing things, and constantly looking around at one plant and saying, why is that one happy and that one's not? What was the difference? What did I do differently? And learning from that. And I think to be a good organic farmer, I think observation, and you're a constant scientist, really. You come up with your little theories about how things are going to work, and you might say you design an experiment to test it, and it's never very scientific. And never done a control or anything. And you see, did that work? Did it work better than what you were doing before? And you move forward. And that's how I love to work. I'm really not interested in following a blueprint that someone else has created. And I realize that is a very common characteristic of entrepreneurs. I mean, and I'm great at innovation, and I'm not very good at perfection. So, by the time it gets to that iterative improvement where you're moving towards perfection, where the sort of learning curve is leveling off, well, I've got bored well before then, and moved on to something else. So, ideally you get someone else to take the idea on at that stage, and because I guess innovation is probably my strong point. Perfecting things certainly isn't.
2 points there we can pick up. One is what is your greatest innovation or that comes to mind, and from growing organic vegetables, and then the other one was you handing over to others who can continue to perfect it. So, what number one? Anything that comes to mind from your growing?
I'm just constantly innovating. I mean, I can't. In my early days, it was putting the hoe on the front of the tractor or in between the front and the back wheels, so you didn't have someone on the back steering it. I figured that out for myself, and made a machine to do that. I mean, today that's how all hoes virtually are. All inter-row cultivation of crops work like that. So I mean, and right through to, I don't know. Today I was figuring out an irrigation system for my crops and implementing that, and we're going to pump the water up the hill using photovoltaics and let it run down during the night through a generator. So hopefully the farm can be not quite off grid, but going that way. So just constantly. I mean, it's just what I do, and I've also, my hands are stinging at the moment because I'm experimenting with cultivating nettles, and I've been messing around with that. So there's always so I just love trialing new things, and I'm very, very lucky really to have the agency, autonomy to be able to just go ahead and do that. And I think so few people have that in their lives. I mean, most people live very compromised lives, basically trying to keep someone else happy, normally their boss. And I know that I would be absolutely terrible at that. And I'm just really lucky that I was able to, make my own way in life, and and have an incredible level. I get up every day and it's me that decides what I'm going to do. That just isn't how most people live. So I feel very, very glad about that. You asked about handing over to other people.
Yeah,
I
but
think,
maybe we can talk about the journey. The time you were sort of saying just before this that you started selling vegetables out the back of your car,
yeah.
and before we talk about what's just happened, like the last couple of months, how do you get? What was the journey from selling the vegetables outside the back of the car to local?
I mean, the business grew. I think I have sat down and worked it out. I think compounded it. I think I turned over £6,000 in my first year. And I think if you work at a compound rate of growth of 30% a year between 6,000 or something, you get to about 100 million after 37 years or something, which is about where we are now. So, it was just an insane kind of growth. And at some stages, it was growing much faster than that. And I sometimes sit down and ask myself why. And I was, why I was sort of driven like that in a, really quite an insane way in some ways. And I was driven by my own insecurities and my need to prove myself to myself, but probably actually to my father, if I'm honest. That's probably where it started. And by the time he died and told me that, actually, son, you've done rather well. By that time, it had just become a habit. So even though he was he had given me his approval, it just becomes a habit. And that is incredibly common with entrepreneurs. They are normally really insecure, almost pathetically so in some ways. It's and that's what drives them. And sometimes that insecurity and sort of blindness to their own, what it is that drives, leads them to do some pretty bad things, I'm afraid. So and to lose a sort of perspective on things. I think I'm unusual like that, in that I have always questioned, perhaps having those around me. I've got 4 siblings who are always pretty keen to question what I do. Won't stop me getting too big for my boots, and probably a good thing in the long run. Yeah, so it grew and grew and grew, and we went from selling to local shops to selling to wholesalers in London, selling to supermarkets. I hated that, and eventually in 1993 making the first delivery of a vegetable box. And over I guess almost 10 years, we sort of changed the business from, it seemed like quite a quick change at that time, but in modern days of pivoting, everyone talks about pivoting, then it would probably be quite a slow change. But by the early 2000s, we were selling 95% of our stuff direct to consumer, to the doorstep, and that's enabled the business to continue to grow. And I have never, I've never sold equity. I've always, and never really got into a position of sort of debt when I was beholden to anyone, really. I suppose as it grew and grew, and I started questioning more and more, why I was doing this, and was it right, was it fair, and came to appreciate that my success, was largely on the back of other people's efforts. I mean, I might have taken the risk with the money early on and had the entrepreneurial drive, but the people doing the work, that wasn't me anymore. And I, I suppose, and at the same time, I also managing people. I found myself just getting quite frustrated, really, by just how poor most conventional management, probably including my own, was, and how it didn't make use of the abilities of the people, within the business. That, really, if you get a half of someone's potential, I would say you've done pretty well. And if they deliver a half of their potential, that's pretty good as well. But most people want to deliver, they want to come to work and bring their whole self to work and find an outlet for their creativity and their independence, and probably be able to make decisions for themselves and share in some of the rewards of that. And I suppose that thought process just led me. I've visited a few other businesses. I thought about cooperatives. I have started a cooperative. I thought about joint working with other businesses, encouraging other people to follow our path and having a kind of umbrella organization of regional box schemes. And unfortunately, I don't think I think those were all good models. I think they could have worked, but probably I'm not actually I'm not a particularly cooperative person. It's taken me a long time to sort of accept that. So I'm good at leading. Anyway, it came to a certain stage that I eventually I met the chairman of the John Lewis Partnership. He was giving me an award at the Royal Agricultural Show, and we started talking, and I started talking about my business and why I did it. And he said, you should consider employee ownership. And of course, John Lewis Partnership is the biggest employee-owned business, and that was back in about 2005, I think, and it took us another 13 years, I suppose, before we actually eventually became employee-owned, and that was in June 2018, 5 years ago. And it's been a tremendous success. And employee ownership is about giving people a meaningful say in how the business is run and giving them a share in the profits, and those two things have been very successful. It's also enabled me to this could have happened within conventional management structures, I suppose, but to enable other people to come in behind me and support me and eventually take over. People who are much better at the detail, at systems, they run a health and safety policy and data security and all the stuff. When you've got 1,000 people, you have to have those sorts of systems, and to implement them in a sort of mature way. I mean, at 63, I think I might finally be starting to grow up, but I can be pretty impetuous and childish in my behavior sometimes, again, like many entrepreneurs, I would say. And bringing that support in behind, but learning to work as a team has enabled us to go from strength to strength. So that sort of transition from founder to the first post-founder, management, I think we've managed really very, very well, actually, quite unusually well. It's a pretty painful transition usually, and I think Riverford has done it very well.
Are you a healthcare professional looking to elevate your knowledge of nutrition and lifestyle medicine? Nutritank CIC wants to empower you to have the communication skills and knowledge of lifestyle medicine to improve your patient's health through free CME accredited webinars hosted every Monday evening, Learn from leading experts in the field and gain access to cutting-edge research and best practice. Here's what you gain through our webinars. Enhanced knowledge of nutrition and lifestyle medicine and applying it in clinical practice. Continued medical education credits to maintain your license. And free access to a library of previously recorded high-quality educational webinars. Take action now. Register for upcoming webinars or become a member at nutritank.com. The links will be provided in the show notes. Invest in your clinical practice and patients' well-being and fuel their health with Nutritank CIC. It's an incredible story, and also, just showing, as you said before, different to other founders who sold the shares to the employees, which is a different way of doing things compared to a lot of other founders. And how have your employees taken that? What's their sort of view on this process? What's the feedback you've been given?
I would say they've grown into it from a period where, probably a third or less were quite enthusiastic, to a position where 2/3, 3/4, probably even more than that, are really quite enthusiastic about the post and highly engaged. And, I think they thought, well, to quote one of them, I think they thought I was blowing smoke up their arse originally, that this was just a wheeze. But I think, and you have to gain people's trust through your actions, not just your words. It's something Boris Johnson might have done well to heed. But, it is, you can only, impressive words will only get you so far. You have to deliver, you have to behave in a way that is consistent with those words. And I think Riverford does, in the way that it treats its co-owners, in the way it treats its supplier and its environmental policies. We are very considered, and we take a long-term view. And I'd say that we're very honest and honourable in the way we go about our trade. And I think that is greatly appreciated. And by virtue of being able to communicate directly with our customers, we're able to convey that and communicate and explain why we're doing what we're doing and take them with us. And we enjoy a huge amount of support and loyalty from our customers, which means that we have to spend less on marketing, and we enjoy, very good customer retention, and that enables us to run an efficient business and spend the money on the things that we want to spend it on. And so that might be, in paying voluntary living wage, which we have done for several years, and and on top of that, a profit share, and that sort of pays back. That people stay longer, they put more into their work, so that you're able to be more successful. Again, I think my problem with capitalism, well, I have quite a lot of problems with capitalism. I mean, the first problem being that the assumption that we are motivated solely by greed, which is arrived with Margaret Thatcher and has just intensified ever since. I think it is reaching a crisis now where it can't sustain itself. But I mean, it's just rubbish. I mean, that is not. It is clearly a one motivator. We are, all of us, selfish to varying degrees, but we're also motivated by wanting to do things well, by having shared values around the business that we like. And in our case, that most of our staff feel pretty strongly about environmental issues, and by having a degree of autonomy and agency over our activities. Those are the most powerful motivators, and there's lots of research to suggest that, and actually much more powerful than money. I mean, it would be stupid to deny that money was a motivator. So I think we have moved beyond what is in many ways a really very inefficient. Naked, unbridled capitalism frustrates me, not just in its grotesque unfairness and the inequality that results from it, which is becoming pretty extreme in this country. It's not just that; it's its actual wastefulness and its short-term approach and its failure to deal with the complex issues, particularly environmental issues around climate change and loss of biodiversity. I find it really very, very frustrating that we that we still have a bunch of politicians who believe that is the only way you can do things. That the market has the answer to everything, and it is tragic. I mean, it's tragic to see what that has done to our country. I mean, particularly over the last 13 years, and these people are not representative of most of Britain and most voters. But they have managed to get to the top of the slippery pole, and well, they are sliding down fairly quickly now. But I mean, thank God. But I mean, it's going to take so long to recover. Well, particularly in education, in health, in agriculture, the result of these very, very short-term market-based policies, it's going to take years. It's going to take decades to recover from. I mean, I do feel quite angry. I wish I didn't, because I don't think it's good for my health. But I mean, but I don't, it's just really, really frustrating. It's a tragedy, and for these people to wrap themselves in the Union Jack and behave as if there's some sort of Churchillian, modern day Churchillian prime minister, when the people who actually fought in the war, my parents, would be absolutely appalled by what they stand for. I mean, they're not being patriotic. We need to. Anyway, I'm going off on one there, and you can stop me. And
I want
yeah.
to jump in there because you've said some interesting points about how the current agricultural ideology within the UK is not helping, natural Britain in fighting climate change. What should we be doing within our agricultural policy or the way we farm? What should we be doing to help nature and to combat climate change within this country?
Okay. I mean, there's very long and complex answers to that question.
They are long and complex answers. What is the issue behind the current status quo of farming food within this country?
Okay, well, we've arrived at the situation we're in. It's it's a long, long history. It'll probably go back to before the Industrial Revolution, and then the repeal of the Corn Laws, which exposed us to global commodity prices, 2 world wars. There's a long, long history in how we got to this position. But since 1980, which is more or less when Margaret Thatcher came to power, and neoliberalism, has more or less, ruled the waves since then as a guiding kind of ideology. In 1980, we were about 80% self-sufficient in food. Today, we are 50 to 60%. So that we have a decline in the amount of food that we produce, and at the same time a massive loss of biodiversity, at least 50% of which is attributable to farming. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of climate change also attributable to farming. Yet we contribute 1.6% of GDP. So to be designing our agricultural policy around our economic output is especially at a time when loss of biodiversity and climate change, are, I think everyone would acknowledge, such huge and critical factors, is just completely bonkers. Yeah. And to be fair, I mean, to politicians, actually even Michael Gove, since Brexit, the idea of paying farmers public money for public goods as opposed to public money just to own land, which is pretty much what happened under the Common Agricultural Policy, I'm sure it is the right policy. What we have seen, though, unfortunately, is just utter incompetence and vacillation in policies in terms of actually turning that into in terms of implementing that in agricultural policy, and that. And I think that I'm guessing you could probably say the same about the National Health Service. That's very complex issues that require some very careful planning and implementation, which cannot be delivered when we have such extreme short-termism and the assumption that the market will provide the solution to every problem. So. Yes, there has been some progress, but woefully slow, and I think farmers feel pretty abandoned, confused, depressed. You know, I think a lot of them, I mean, some of them just want to make money and just are out and out eco vandals. But I mean, there are a hell of a lot of farmers who actually do want to contribute to being part of the solution rather than part of the problem. But they do need a sort of stable policy framework in order to deliver that.
I guess the question would be, you know, Riverford Organics has been really successful in being very productive. But do you feel, or is there scope within this country that, you know, more farmers can take the same route that Riverford has taken? And is the argument that it would still produce as much food as we would need for our supermarkets?
Well, there are a few critical things. I mean, we need to eat less animal protein, so, you know, meat, dairy, eggs. You know, we cannot live sustainably in this country, you know, with 60, 70 million people, or indeed on the planet with 7 going on 10 billion people, if we continue to, you know, eat the sort of level of animal protein that we do in this country, in the US and in Australia. It's just hopeless. We are going to destroy ourselves if we do that. And as developing countries adopt our diet, you know, that is, you know, so that's the you know, a very critical thing that has to change. But and then alongside that, I think, you know, we have to embrace a more ecological approach to food production, which in most cases, I think a fairly key part of that is embracing the concept of complexity, rather than every agricultural policy in my lifetime has all been about specialization, simplification, specialization, and scale. You know, so when my father kept chickens, pigs, sheep, dairy, raised beef, grew barley. You know, it was a very, very complex farm, and you know, many of his neighbours were making, you know, having orchards and making cider as well. I mean, by the time my brother took over, it was pretty much down to, which there were still some enterprises around the side, pretty much down to being a dairy farm, as many of our neighbours were. Others had gone into combinable crops. You know, some were specialist pigs, some were specialists, but most farms are essentially single enterprise farms now. That is so at odds with nature, and that's why we have the sort of monocultures that we have. But that's so at odds with nature. I think we really need to learn from nature, and I have seen this in action. I mean, I've worked with farmers in Uganda for the last 20 years or so, and I've seen some of the best agricultural practice I've seen anywhere. Well, I would say the best, you know, where you have incredibly complex systems which are very knowledge intensive as opposed to input intensive, where people might be growing 100 crops in an acre in 3 different canopies, and they can be unbelievably, you know, productive. You know, like 10 or 20 times more productive than the monocrop next door. And I suppose I've learned from that and that way of thinking, and then brought it back to my farm. And we are experimenting with a silver pasture system, growing walnuts and hazelnuts with cattle and sheep grazing underneath, which can be 5 times more productive than just, and sequester carbon and boost biodiversity, 5 times more productive than just grazing those animals underneath. So, you know, when people say we can't feed the world, and certainly can't feed the world with organic farming, no, we can't if we carry on farming the way we are. But were we to embrace these much more complex systems, we could do. In fact, we could do it very easily. But you know, this does require, you know, in the long-term investments, and food probably is going to end up being more expensive. I say probably, but it will certainly cost more to farm in that way. But food, on average, multiplies in price about 6 times from the farm gate to when we buy it. And every, you know, that has gone up from 3 or 4 times when I started farming to 6 times today. I mean, I don't see why that multiple has to keep on getting bigger, i.e., why the food manufacturing and the food retailing industry has to take a bigger and bigger part, you know, share. That, I mean, you know, if we could reverse that, I think we could have farming, the sort of farming we want, you know, and have affordable food. But we have to change the systems of food distribution, and a key part of that actually is people not being so obsessed with choice. providing, a supermarket with 50,000 SKUs, that's different individual items, which are all available with 99 point something% fulfillment, 52 weeks of each year is extremely difficult, extremely wasteful, and is inflicting incredible costs on our environment, and actually also on the people who work in those industries and have to fulfill them. So I think choice is a real issue. The idea that consumers are always right and can have whatever they want whenever they want and pay bugger all for it is something that needs to change.
Touching on there about soil health and how eating seasonally helps with soil health. Because you're saying that the Ugandan farmers are creating really complex farming systems, and I'm sure a lot of the different vegetables or fruits that are being grown help to put back into the soil. So what have you learnt from that and that you've brought into Riverfords over the years?
Well, I mean, a pretty key element of organic farming and now what people call regenerative farming is keeping the ground covered and also keeping roots in the soil, actually, preferably living plants in the soil the whole time, and trying to get what you want without doing that thing of scorching the earth, either spraying off with glyphosate, as is very commonly done, and some people even call that regenerative farming, or ploughing, so inverting the top 6 or 8 inches of the soil to create a seed bed, which is tremendously destructive. I mean, if you can grow, crops without doing that, that's a much, much better way. It's quite challenging. It's much, much easier if you're growing perennial crops. And I have a bit of an obsession with that, and why I'm so keen to grow nuts, for instance, it makes it much, much easier to do that without destroying the soil. Because, I mean, farming is, and actually particularly vegetable farming, and I'm afraid to say particularly organic vegetable farming, requires a horrendous, cultivation of the soil, which, not only does it lead to the oxidation and loss of organic matter, you're destroying all the fibers of life. I mean, probably particularly, I mean, for the earthworms and invertebrates, it's pretty awful, but it's probably even worse for the mycorrhizal fungi, which we now know are so critical to soil health. And to a lesser extent, the bacteria, they can probably stand it. But I mean, I think there's been a huge development over the last. I mean, not that this is new knowledge. I mean, I was actually taught this, at university in the late 70s. I remember soil scientists talking about, mycorrhizal and soil health and but no one listened to them. I don't know when people, but this has been going in tandem with the whole biome thing, and it has just exploded over the last 10 years. But I think people are really understanding that yields in many areas are falling because of the quality of the soil, and that we need to be, the custodians of the soil and be much more respectful of that and come to understand it. I mean, it is so unbelievably jaw-droppingly complex, what goes on under our feet, that I think, we won't understand it in my lifetime, but there's some pretty good principles that you can follow to try and make things better. And one of them is trying to reduce the amount of cultivation that you do. And a pretty critical way of that is trying to move as much as possible towards perennial crops and complex cropping systems, particularly that incorporate perennial crops. And I've given an example of one, but I mean, in what I saw in Uganda, you might just have some really intensive vegetable cultivation, much, much easier when you've got sun overhead in the tropics. In our latitudes, access to sunlight is much more critical, and you probably can't have the same level of shading. And then they, above that, they might be growing, coffee and cocoa and vanilla and some lower trees. Actually, they grow a lot of vanilla in that area. And above there would be tree crops. I mean, sometimes the leaves were grazed for animals. Sometimes it was for timber. And I mean, it was just unbelievably productive. Much more difficult to do, A, when the sun's lower in the sky, and B, in a high wage economy, where people are typically earning 50 times, as much per day as they would be in rural Uganda.
So it is incredibly complex what you're describing. But just for our audience, what could you give a definition of perennial plants?
Sorry, a perennial plant is one that either has an above ground point like a tree and keeps on growing, or has a below ground thing that it will regenerate from every year, so that you don't have to cultivate the soil every year. It just keeps on coming back. So I've just been out picking artichokes this morning. So they're one of my favorite perennials. They just come back. We typically leave them in the ground for 6-7 years before we'll move on to another crop. So, rhubarb in the vegetable world, rhubarb would be another one. Obviously, all the fruits, raspberries, strawberries are perennials. The nuts, hazelnuts, and so on that we grow, all perennials. Unfortunately, most of the key starchy crops that we are reliant on for our most of our energy, so it would be wheat, rice, potatoes, maize, are all annuals. I mean, interestingly, their progenitors, their ancestors were, I think, almost all, probably not potatoes, but most of the others were. So all the Brahminaceae, which is where we get our wheat and barley and rye come from, they're all perennials. I mean, maize was a perennial, rice was a perennial, and we've turned it into an annual. But there is a lot of interesting work to turn it back into this perennial habit, so that, you could, in an ideal world, drive your combine over it once a year and not have to do all the establishment. But of course, there's no money in that for a seed company, because they'd only sell the seed once. So, there's no one. Most of the people who are working on perennializing these crops are not commercial seed breeders.
Wow.
There is 50,000 hectares of perennial wheat being grown in China at the moment as a result of these programs. Not something anyone hears about. There's no publications, because no one's making any money out of it. The seed companies aren't. It's not how our system works. It's very difficult to make money out of these sort of knowledge intensive rather than product intensive industries. I mean, obviously you can patent things and do it that way, but I think it's staggering when you think how much money has gone into developing, genetically modified gene editing and so on, and countless billions have gone into that, and just a few 100,000 probably have gone into developing these crops, and I think they've achieved more than the whole GM revolution has. But it's not the way our capitalist system works to promote it.
I remember one module I studied in my biomedical degree, which was on innovation in bioscience, and it was touching upon seed development. And but one of the things that was really crazy to hear was that a lot of our seeds are now just owned, or food is owned by only a handful of companies.
50% of the global seed trade is controlled by. It was 4, but one of them has bought the other one. So it's now 3 companies. Pretty scary, I would say. Not a good situation to be in.
How in the UK can we sort of change that? What do we?
Well, it's. I mean, what happens is these companies, they make money, they buy up the small independent companies and increase their sort of stranglehold. It used to be Monsanto's stated ambition to control the food supply. I mean, they've had so many legal cases against them over the toxicity of glyphosate. They've now been bought by Bayer, isn't it? I think. And so that particular aim has gone, or at least been not seen.
Right.
I mean, how do you fight it? It's very, very difficult. I mean, we do. I mean, on a small scale, on our farm here, we do host an independent seed producer. Probably turning over £250,000. The absolutely tiny business that is keeping some of these old open pollinated varieties alive. It would be silly to. I mean, a lot of plant breeding, modern plant breeding, is brilliant. I mean, the sort of revolution of hybrids. I mean, I wouldn't want to go back to growing all open pollinated vegetables as they were mostly when I started. I mean, I don't want to turn my back on science and progress. I just think we need to be a bit more considered in how we apply it, and having the seed supply controlled by 3 companies who have, don't have the best reputation in terms of what they have delivered to this planet, I would say. Monsanto, probably my pet hate. I mean, they were responsible for PCBs, which are still polluting our ocean. They're probably the main cause of the decline in marine mammal populations. And as far as I know, they've done nothing to compensate us all for all the money they made selling PCBs through the 70s and 80s before they were finally banned. So these aren't great companies that I would want the future of the planet to be put in their hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
They exist to make money for their shareholders. That's more or less the rule. It's corporate law. Let's not pretend that they're philanthropic in any way.
Let's go back to seasonal eating, or the importance of seasonal eating. And it's a subject you spoke about at the College of Medicine 2019 annual conference. Why is it so important for us to be eating seasonally, do you think?
Well, I probably should say that I'm not a dogmatic seasonalist.
Yeah.
So I'm not suggesting that we go to 100% UK diet. I mean, my God, I wouldn't want to live without lemons. But I think we could eat a 70, 80, 90% seasonal diet of, in terms of fruit and vegetables, 90 in vegetables, 90%, and, still have a very varied and enjoyable diet. So I'm a pragmatist. I would just think we want to need to get. I mean, we're down to around about 50% or less being UK produced, and some of that I wouldn't even say was seasonal. As a matter of fact, I have a problem with heated greenhouses, for instance. They're the most environmentally insane use of fossil fuels, and so I wouldn't include that as seasonal or acceptable seasonal food anyway. But why does it matter? I think it's pretty hard to put in forward evidence to say that climatically, actually, I mean, the moving vegetables from Southern Europe on a truck is it's not great, but it's not awful. It's far better than producing them, say, in heated glass in this country, or sometimes trying to grow crops outside their climatic range. It's awful, but for my mind, the biggest argument for sort of seasonal and local eating is probably the sort of cultural connection that you have with your food. And that wherever I go in the world, where there are rich cultures, I mean, a hell of a lot of it is around food, and that will be around traditions that have built up over generations around what grows in that country, and it'll be very different when you go from place to place. But increasingly we eat a diet which is homogenous wherever you go, and I think that is culturally depriving us of our roots, and I feel impoverished as a result of that. And I mean, more tangibly, I think the less connection you feel with your ingredients, the less time you're going to spend cooking them, and the more ultra-processed food you're going to get, and the more people are going to die from diabetes and inflammatory bowel disease. So there are sort of more rational, perhaps less pie in the sky, arguments for that. And I think we will prove one day, and I don't have solid scientific evidence for this, that there is a link between the health of the soil, the way the food is produced, and the health of the people who eat it. And I can show you cabbages grown on this farm and cabbages grown, awash with nitrogen on a conventional farm, and they look, smell, taste, feel completely different. I cannot quote much scientific evidence. There is a bit of evidence that they're rich, higher in vitamins and minerals, but the evidence base is not strong. I think, I think it will come. I mean, I think I'm even tempted to sponsor some research myself, because I'm sure the evidence is there, but I couldn't point you towards scientific papers. So, but I mean, there is certainly evidence that that if you eat crap, highly processed food, you will be a hell of a lot less healthy, and and we have an epidemic of type 2 diabetes as a result, and possibly cancers, as I said, bowel disease. It is the cause of a lot of ill health, and that is indisputable. So how are we we need to eat better ingredients, better food made from better ingredients, and be willing to cook more from scratch. And I think you're much more likely to achieve that if you have a seasonal and local food culture. I really don't want to go back to as it was Teresa Coffey, wasn't it, last can't remember when she suggested that when there weren't enough tomatoes around in February, we should all eat turnips. I mean, English turnips in February, which is when she said it, are a hideous thing that I wouldn't want to inflict on anyone. So I don't, I don't want to. It's the most important thing is we eat lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, and if we can eat local and organically grown ones, well, so much the better. But the most important thing is that we eat lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, and I wouldn't want to. And let's not forget that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Hey everyone. I hope you're enjoying this episode so far and learning a lot. For those of you who are new listeners, welcome. If you're finding this information valuable, I would love for you to consider joining our regular listener family. Just hit that follow button wherever you're listening and you'll never miss a new episode. By the way, one of our main goals is to educate as many healthcare professionals as possible about the power of nutrition and lifestyle medicine. So if you know someone who might benefit from this information, whether it's a colleague, friend, or family member working in the field, please consider sharing this episode with them. Now let's get back to the show and dive deeper. Our audience of healthcare professionals, young healthcare professionals, what can they do in their communities to improve planetary health and, by extension, human health?
Well, I mean, the people who need the help most are the people on lower incomes who eat most of the crap food, unfortunately. And they tend to live in areas, sorry, I'm just telling you what I'm sure you all know anyway. They tend to eat areas, some of them, what people would describe as fresh food deserts, where they live. It's very hard to buy good fresh food and probably even more expensive. And buying crappy food made with crappy ingredients with, lots of fat, sugar and salt and, just high in starchy foods is the cheapest way to feed yourself. And we come to the position where I understand, going to a, chicken shop and eating chicken wings and chips is probably about the cheapest option for many people, which is extraordinary when you consider, the chicken was a luxury until 30 or 40 years ago. How do you change that? I mean, very, very difficult. And I don't think any individual farmer, retailer has got hope. This requires, government action. I did a debate with Henry Dimbleby last week, actually. And I think a very good starting point for anyone wanting to understand the nature of our food system and where it went wrong. I'm not saying it all went wrong. There've been lots of good things as well. But I mean, the food strategy, Henry Dimbleby's food strategy, which you can download, or you used to be able to. I'm pretty sure you still can. Is a really, I think it's about 140 pages. It's actually surprisingly, I don't think I've ever read one of those reports from beginning to end. And I just sat down and read that. It was really pretty easy, and that will give you a really good understanding. And he follows through with some pretty good, I think fairly modest. I mean, I'd love to go a lot further than he did, but I think his recommendations of what we might do are pretty sensible. So, and I'm, say a meat tax was too far for him. He just didn't think that was politically acceptable. But sugar tax and banning and advertising of junk food before the thresholds and that sort of thing, I think are absolutely sensible. But it is very, it's going to be a slow clawing our way back. And I honestly don't know the answers. I mean, we when I say Riverford, which I sold to its staff the last 23% of the shares last week, actually, and I have left almost £1 million in the business, which is a bit of a drop in the ocean. But to try and experiment to find how we can develop innovative routes of trying to get good quality organic vegetables to people on lower incomes. And the key to me, I hope, is of making it affordable and accessible, is trying to get away from this 6 times multiple between farmer and, can we get a more efficient distribution mechanism? Can we persuade people to accept less choice and less convenience, and as a result get better food? I know it's not going to be easy, and probably I expect to fail, but I just think it's so important, and I feel so angry about the inequality in our country, and you see that in the conditions that people live in. But now where this term food poverty absolutely drives me mad. We don't have food poverty. We just have poverty, and we have poverty largely as a result of the increasing, amount that people have to pay putting a roof over their heads, actually. For poor people, I think it's typically 40%, lowest 25% of incomes paying 40% on putting a roof over their heads. And the nation spends 10% on their food, so 4 times as much. Actually, that's not really true because poor people spend more on food. It's probably getting on for 15%. But they spend, a hell of a lot, at least double and probably treble on rents. So we talk about people not being able to afford food, but it's because they're paying such a ridiculous amount for their rent, which is it's just a tax on poor people by rich people, i.e. property owners. That's what's happening. I mean, they're just accumulating more and more money. And it makes, anyway, blah, 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 makes me very, very angry. That's why we need to change of government.
What advice would you give to a young person or someone starting up their enterprise in this field? So someone who wants to create a organic food initiative or some sort of healthy food cooperative or social enterprise. What advice would you give them when they're starting up? It can be generic advice.
Well, I think for anyone setting up, say a social enterprise, a values-driven business, the advice I give those people is to really understand your industry, understand, the product that you want to sell, why the industry is shaped the way it is, and really go into some depth and instead of just a sort of assuming that it shouldn't be like that, it should be like this, therefore I'm going to do it. Understand why it is like that. And within that, you'll sometimes find there are opportunities. There are a lot of madnesses, within the food distribution industry. And where there is a madness, that's often an opportunity. So I think understand your industry, before you challenge it, I think is really important. And that may involve working in it for some time. And the other thing, which advice I give to anyone starting a business is if you can, and I know the day when I started my business and you could go and sell on a local market and so on. I mean, so many businesses now, there's a sort of, I don't know. I still think it applies. I mean, everyone wants to go from being a minnow to being a whale, in about 3 years. I mean, just be a bit patient and produce something and go and try and sell it. And your customers will tell you pretty quickly, whether it's what they want or not and how much they're prepared to pay for it. And, don't spend a fortune on market research and so on. And just be a little bit patient. Don't expect to, in your 3rd year, be raising 20 million from a venture capitalist to go. Well, I know that's the business model that a lot of the young people, and within 10 years, you've generated a life-altering amount of money, is the phrase that and then you sell it on the business on to someone else, and that's the model. Anyway, I hate that model, and I've got so much time for social enterprises, but don't believe, if you are going for a more social enterprise approach, don't expect the values to be enough. Make sure that you really understand the industry that you go into.
Question that I'm sure a lot of people want to know from you is, any self-care tips that you have give to our audience? Just one would be fantastic.
I don't think I'm very good at self-care, really.
Yep, you're walking in the field every day.
Yeah, I do. It's that mindfulness thing, I suppose. Probably an overused word, but actually, just for me, just on those occasions where I do actually feel connected, where I do stop and notice what's under my feet, where I do stop to enjoy a casual conversation with someone on the farm or someone I meet in the lane, and savor that. Instead, I've spent my whole life really rushing on to the next thing, and I think I am getting a little bit better at savoring those moments in the day, and really listening and watching and smelling. And I think that's probably what most people would call mindfulness. So there's nothing original in that, but I think it is a pretty it's a truth.
Absolutely, it is. Guy, thank you so much for talking to me today and for talking to the audience. And it was a pleasure to have you on the podcast. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and I hope I didn't rant too much.
Absolutely, there was an incredible fat nuggets in there. It was really insightful. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, share it with your friends and family and drop us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Don't forget to follow the show on your favourite streaming platform and connect with us online to stay up to date with all the latest news and episodes. If you feel engaged with a particular aspect of today's show, then please comment on our social media posts for this episode. They'll be linked in the show notes. See you in the next episode.